as we continue to have many people who are watching us from home, I will be doing my sermon from a slightly more accessible location for the totality of our congregation. So tell me if this sounds a little familiar. Shir Hamalot B'Shuv Adonai et Shivat Zion Ayinu Kecholim. What is this song all about? We sing it every Shabbat in Birkat Hamazon. What is it? See, this is the great paradox of being a Jewish educator. Is you eventually find that you have taught somebody a melody or a Hebrew passage so well that they can sing it without even blinking. But they sing it so well, they've never bothered looking at the translation. And now they don't know what it means. On the other hand, you have passages that people can't handle. They don't know the Hebrew yet, they don't know the melody, and so they have to read along in the English, and then they get the content. Really, we want both. We want to have mastery of Hebrew and mastery of the melody and mastery of the content. Shir HaMa'alot, a song of ascent, right? Ma'alot. You have an aliyah. You go up, you make aliyah to Israel. Shir HaMa'alot is a song of ascending. Who is ascending in this? Shivat Zion. So Zion is the word Zion, right? Shivat is to be returning. Right? We probably know the word Yitziat, which means to be exiting. Shivat is to be returning. So Shivat Zion, during the return to Zion. What's the return to Zion? Coming together, more historical than just a generic gathering of us. Returning to Israel. I have to warn you, it is before 1948, right? It is before the modern state of Israel because the Psalms are a little bit older. When did we return? After the exile, after the Babylonian exile. Hayinu keholmin. Right? Hayinu, we were like holmin, those who are in a dream. Right? It is as though we were dreamers, as though we were trapped in this dream, or perhaps placed in a dream, as we returned to Israel. Now, as I mentioned, at the moment, for the last few weeks, our Haftarot and texts have been focusing on the coming disaster of Babylon, but I'd like to, perhaps a little prematurely, but perhaps under the circumstances exactly at the right moment, start looking beyond the destruction to the return, to the hope, to the consolation that will dominate our texts from after Tisha B'Av until Rosh Hashanah 7 weeks later. Hayinu keholmin. We was like we were in a dream. The idea that we would return, the idea that we could return after the catastrophe of the Babylonian destruction, it was like a dream. But there's a problem with dreams, which is, what do they mean? It's a little tricky to interpret a dream. Certainly our ancestors thought that dreams were important. They figure prominently in many different parts of the Torah, most famously, of course, Pharaoh's dreams. But they're still hard to interpret, which is why he had to go hire Joseph to do so. We know, and we knew, that God would eventually redeem us from the land of Babylon. We knew that God had promised, through the prophet Isaiah and many others, that our exile following the destruction of the Babylonians in 586 would not be permanent. What we didn't know is when it would stop. That was left to interpretation. And there was a problem, in fact, of when it might happen, and there were some that were perhaps, shall we say, too eager to throw out the Babylonians and to embrace the redemption that had been promised. And every year on the day after Rosh Hashanah, after the second day of Rosh Hashanah, we commemorate Tzom Gedalia, which is the final nail in the coffin of Jewish sovereignty during that time period, because people who thought, now is the time for redemption, shortly after the Babylonian destruction, now is the time, let's go murder their puppet governor, one of our own, Jews killing Jews. And that was when the Babylonians said, all right, fine, now we're not going to mess around. I mean, we've already destroyed your city and your temple, but now we're going to get serious. Now we are going to exile in larger numbers, mass quantities of the population. So, jumping on the redemption bandwagon a little too early led to a lot of catastrophe. So how did we know it was time to return when we finally began to return approximately 70 years later? What was the sign? What was the omen? What was the indication that it was now time? Did a little alarm clock go off somewhere? Written in the heavens? Did we follow a star? No, not that one. That's a different story. Yeah, exactly right. We had no sign. As a matter of fact, even what you might think of as being a sign wasn't treated as a sign. The Babylonians were conquered by the Persians. Sign? Maybe. Let's see how the Persians work out. Cyrus takes over, and Cyrus issues a decree that the Jews may return to the land and rebuild the temple and reconstruct. In fact, we have the core of that decree even confirmed through archaeological evidence, which matches what is found in the Tanakh. The cylinder of Cyrus that has that proclamation. They would write letters on cylinders so they could make copies of it by rolling it over clay, saying that we could return to our land. And indeed, in the 530s or so BCE, Zerubbabel and a group of intrepid young Jews left the area of Babylon, now Persian-controlled, and returned to the land of Israel. Hooray! The redemption has happened. Well, no. Because he was a tiny, tiny percentage of the Jews who were then living in Babylon. The vast majority of the Jews in Babylon said, no, good luck, we'll stay here. We're not sure whether this is the actual redemption or not. Maybe this is the return of the exile. Maybe this is a false start for the return of the exile. We're not 100% sure, just so maybe we'll stay right here. After all, Babylon was working out pretty well now. With the Persians in control of that area, we had more religious freedom. The communities had developed into robust and amazing centers of learning and Jewish life. There was even a certain degree of Jewish autonomy within those communities. So why jump back towards the land of Israel just because one politician has said it's time to go back? We have dealt with different lords and kings and pharaohs who came and went and flipped their positions, or the next person would. And so the majority of the people of the Babylonian community said, we'll wait. We'll wait. The clock ticks. And you know what? The people in the land of Israel are doing okay. The Persians seem to be continuing this policy of tolerance, and they are quite strong. There are no other significant contenders in the area. Let's go ahead and see where this goes. And indeed, in around the 400s, 440s, 450s, Ezra and another group of people from the land of Babel moved back to the land of Israel and reinforced those who had already gone and continue the process of strengthening the community, of rebuilding the temple, and of reigniting Jewish learning and understanding. For many of the people who were living there in Israel at the time had not had the benefit of the great places of study and learning that had been established in Babylon. Was that then the end of redemption? No. A few decades later, Nehemiah comes back. And this time he brings more people with him. Again, helping to buttress the now growing and strengthening community in the land of Israel. Redemption's done? No. As a matter of fact, the Babylonian communities never emptied until the 20th century, sadly. The Babylonian communities remained. And in fact, from that point on, a majority of Jews lived outside of the land of Israel rather than inside. The Jewish diaspora was born at this time. Which group was right? Was the group who returned with the first sign and glimmer of hope during the days of Zerubbabel, the days of Cyrus? Were they the right group? Did they read God's intentions correctly? For them? Yes, it seemed to work out. Was the group who came with Ezra? Were they reading God's intention correctly? For them, it seemed yes. For the group that came with Nehemiah, again, yes. And for the groups who stayed behind during all of these other transitions, were they then ignoring God's decrees? Were they rebelling against God, refusing to return when God had given them the smooth road back to the land of Israel? No. They too were making the right choice at that time. And the continuation of the Babylonian communities, we would see in another 500 years, would become essential for the continuation of Judaism. For when the Second Temple falls, in the year 70, and life within the Roman-controlled land of Israel, the Romans took over shortly after we got back, when that becomes untenable, when that becomes too hard to live, it is the Babylonian community that has been there now for hundreds of years that picks up the slack after the destruction of the land of Israel by the Romans. And they become the seat of learning and leadership for the next 1,000 years to ensure that Judaism will continue, whether it is in the land of Israel or outside the land of Israel. And during that time, they create the great work that we call the Talmud. They create the great scholars that we call the Gaonim. They create what we now recognize as the Siddur, a set section of prayers that is used across the world. And they create the pattern of how Judaism will continue to live for the next 1,000 years. Unfortunately, those communities are hit upon but in very hard times during the 20th century, most importantly after the establishment of the State of Israel, and the Arab countries, in this case mostly in Iraq, continue to persecute the Jews who live in their borders as retaliation for the audacity of there being a Jewish country. But if we understand that at any point during this history, there was not a single right answer. There were wrong answers. The assassins of Gedalia, the murderers, the people who would kill one another believing that they were right, they had the wrong answer. But for those who were unsure whether we should move now or whether we should wait later or whether we should stay here, all three of those options are ratified and are commended by history as being correct. There is no clarity in interpreting this dream of our existence. There is no perfection in knowing exactly what God wants at any given moment or for any given generation. What we do is we turn to our Torah. We turn to each other. We study, we discuss, we debate, we pray. And we come to some understanding of what might be acceptable within the teachings of our faith. And then we use that, but we notice that there are other things that are also acceptable within the teaching of our faith, and some use that. This is not a weakness. This has allowed the strength of our people to continue despite anything that has been thrown against us. And our flexibility, our organic ability to continue to adapt, to process and reinvent ourselves in new places and for new situations, this has been our enduring quality. There is a story told in the Jerusalem Talmud, the earlier version of what would become the Talmud of Babylon, that says the two rabbis were out, and as they were walking, the dawn began to crest over the hills. And as the light began to slowly increase, one of them, Rav Chisda, said to the other, this is how redemption works. There is a little light, and then a little more, and then a little more, and then a little more. And as long as it continues to increase, Israel's redemption continues. There are no light switches in history. We do not switch from A to B instantaneously. We recognize moments that need adaptation. If they endure, we recognize enduring changes that will need to be in place. But we continue to assess, we continue to discuss, we continue to pray. We continue to seek our path and continue to hope that there will be a little more light tomorrow than there is today. Shabbat Shalom.